for you, it starts in seeing up in Vancouver, sort of these protests, these medical freedom protests. But talk about like just the sort of the genesis of and what's happening with this metaphor.
Yeah. So first of all, it's great to see you. Great to see you, Emma.
Great to see you.
It's a different kind of book in sort of tone and style. It's kind of more playful and experimental in the sense that it uses the doppelganger as a tool to look at all different kinds of ways that we double ourselves, right? So I happen to have a doppelganger. There are lots of people who do. I get perennially confused with Naomi Wolf, but the book is not about that. It's about the way that we create doubles of ourselves online. It's the way AI creates doubles of us. It's the way that we partition our political world into this kind of very reactive doubling where the right has a sort of replica copycat version of every social media platform, fundraising tool. They're even making their own money, on the Steve Bannon show. And also copycat arguments, like doublings of arguments. But we also, on the left side of the spectrum, are very reactive with them. So it's about all of that. My books have always tried to make maps of our political moment. I did that with the shock doctrine and with This Changes Everything. With this book, it's also a map of the kind of COVID moment and how we have changed, how our political culture is changing. And it's a weirder map because we are in weirder times. So it's trying to kind of wrap its arms around the prevalence of conspiracy culture and the way lots of people are kind of becoming doppelgangers of who they used to be, right? We all know people who have changed, and we're trying to understand, is this still the same person? How did this change happen? What are the financial incentives for this change? Are we the ones who've changed? We're all accusing each other of having been, become victims of like invasion of the body snatchers. So what is happening? And so Doppelganger tries to answer some of that.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, it just COVID is such and you write about this obviously, but it's such an important moment to analyze that very dynamic because it was an accelerant in many ways. And you see the mirroring of certain arguments when it comes to COVID, right? Where the critique of big pharma on the liberal left side is the same kind of prism by which these anti-vaxxers choose to come at this argument, but it's quite, anti-humanist and also skeptical of expertise and aligned with the right at this point. What was that dynamic like writing about that?
Yeah, well, I think, Sam mentioned seeing these protests in the community where I live. I started the pandemic in the US. I had been teaching at Rutgers and, we were just kind of outside New York. And there was a little bit of this starting to happen, particularly outside of gyms. And it was mainly like the extremely religious and the extremely fit who were the first people to decide to not believe that COVID was real, right? So they were going, streaming into mega churches. With the community where I lived had a very large Orthodox Jewish community that was breaking various lockdown rules. And then there were the gym owners who were like, no, we demand the right to lift weights, even if this, and so, part of what I'm trying to understand is like, what is the common thread between these two? Like, why is there this kind of coming together of the wellness crowd and the sort of greenish left, right? And the far right. And because after I moved from the States to Canada to be near my parents who are in their 80s and not well. And this stuff is a lot stronger outside of big cities. And so I've talked to a lot of people who are in rural communities who've seen a lot of this, where it's not so much the far left as I call it the far right. Like there are people who are interested in alternative health. Maybe they're interested in GMO foods, but mainly from a wellness perspective. And then you started hearing that people who are vaccinated are actually GMO people. Like the vaccine has. So it mixes and matches parts of the discourse that I recognize as somebody who's been part of the left for 30 years, and this we don't love big pharma, we don't like big tech, we don't like big agra, and it takes that and it warps it and it turns it into something that actually is not taking on these large businesses, that isn't taking on the trade rules that have allowed them to have such an outsized impact as the movements that I've been a part of have done. And it kind of pivots it. And suddenly it's about immigrants, and suddenly it's about the schools are turning your kids trans. And so I'm trying to understand, like, how do you do that pivot? How do you take the yoga instructor who was concerned about a vaccine and turn them into a warrior against critical race theory? And all of that's happening.
I mean, I want to go back and sort of see if we can trace some of this, because back in, like in 2006, maybe it was, like, I had a buddy, he was living in rural Nebraska, and we would have these conversations where he's like, he seemed to be almost like politicized in the sense that he was like, Dick Cheney is horrible. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. And he's like, he's literally, he is literally, I've been reading David Icke's and he's literally like a lizard person. And I'm like, wait, no, that's not it. It's not that he's a lizard person. It's all these policies he's doing. He's like, oh, you're just getting caught up in politics. And I'm like, wait, no, he's not really a lizard person. And it feels like that is sort of the same dynamic that's going on here, where on one level there can be some type of agreement, right? Like, pharmaceutical companies are bad, but there is a lack of sort of like an ideological underpinning that then, I mean, I think at one point you wrote, facts wrong, but feelings right.
Yeah, and this is true of Wolf, my own doppelganger. And, where this started to feel more serious to me was when she really made this right-wing turn and suddenly was on Tucker Carlson's show when he had one on Fox, and was going on Steve Bannon's show very regularly. And what she was talking about was this claim that the vaccine verification apps that we all downloaded onto our phones was actually a kind of a covert plot to bring, as she said, tyranny to the West, a Chinese-style social credit system, that these apps were going to be able to listen to our conversations wherever we were, know who we were meeting with. And the response from liberals online was like, oh, just crazy rantings, but also wait till they hear about cell phones. So it was a kind of a knowing sneer, right? Like, we all know that it's actually our cell phones that are tracking us in these ways. But that really struck me as something very interesting. And it explained why this was getting the kind of traction it was, because, do we, people on the left side of the spectrum have a plan for what to do about surveillance capitalism? We all know it's real. We all know that there was supposed to be something happening under the Biden administration, but very little has happened. I know they're trying, but, our data is not safe. Our cell phones really have outrageous capacity to keep track of us. And so that's the kind of feelings that they get right. Right. So she's taking all of our collective surveillance fears that are real and justified, and very little is happening. And we are having this kind of sneering reaction to it because we're not doing anything about it, I would argue, and pivoting it onto something that feels like you could do something about it. Like, we could just get the apps off our phone. Right. And that's the appeal of all of these conspiracy theories, is that they tap into very real fears and anger about real inequality and injustice. But then, like you say about the lizard people, the story becomes not, this is a system that is rigged and we need to change the system and maybe we need democratic socialism. There's this group of lizard people. They meet every year at Davos. Let's get the lizard people. And that's the kind of narrative structure of QAnon, but it really is the narrative structure of every conspiracy theory. And certainly the most ancient conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, right? Like, there's this cabal of Jews. And that's why, back to the 1800s, anti-Semitism was described as the socialism of fools, right? It is how you understand injustice and inequality if you don't have a structural analysis of capital. And so you're going to believe that there's a room somewhere. And then, the QAnon story of there's going to be a great storm. There's going to be a moment when Donald Trump leads the white hats to arrest all the black hats and send them to Gitmo. Like, that's the story that they're telling. And, I'm sure, as both of you have been, around the left for a long time and pointed out injustice and inequality for a long time, you can imagine the appeal of a story that says there's actually going to be a day of accountability, right?
Well, that sounds like religious. It sounds like religion when you say that. I mean, to Sam's point about your friend in Nebraska, where he thinks Dick Cheney is a lizard person, it's an anti-political construction. It's a more, the facts wrong, feelings right construction is one of emotion, and one that eschews political solutions and structural change for essentially demons amongst us. And then, I think some of that mirror world is the manipulation of kind of spirituality, which had been in many ways connected to the left in previous kind of political collaborations and contingency and cohorts, to an entirely different anti-political, anti-solidarity, very isolated system of complete paranoia that's been manipulated in that way.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. But the Dick Cheney example is a good one, right? In the sense that it points to the way that conspiracy culture on the right, which is absorbing parts of the left in real time, and we've all seen it, feeds off of impunity and left failures to hold people like Dick Cheney accountable, right? Like in a just world, Dick Cheney would have faced some accountability for the lies that led to the Iraq War. For the fact, I think, Sam, probably the first interview we had way back when was probably having to do with Halliburton's contracts, that Dick Cheney oversaw. And so I think that this level of impunity that we have in our culture is profoundly corrosive. And I think it unhinges people. I think bearing witness to the lack of accountability over so many decades eventually pushes some people into the arms of this sort of more religious narrative that promises some almost otherworldly level of accountability.
Well, let's break down these sort of the elements of how we got, because I also distinctly remember, that guy, I don't want to harp too much on him anymore, but he was, an early Alex Jones fan. And, my idea of Alex Jones, 15, 20 years ago was, if this guy didn't exist, the CIA would invent him, because he's taking people down. He's identifying a problem, right? The world is, we don't have much power in this world. And he's saying it's, people drinking blood at the Bilderberger group or whatever it is. And it completely, it depoliticizes. It mystifies and depoliticizes. So we have that element going on. And you mentioned the lack of accountability.
And the thing about depoliticizing, though, that is slightly, I think we should be clear on what we mean by depoliticizing. From a kind of a strict Marxist perspective, it's a depoliticization and a mystification. But from a Steve Bannon perspective, it's extremely strategic and political, and it has a political plan,
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I want to ask you about, the different sort of components that exist here. For instance, when we talk about Naomi Wolf, I remember at the end of the Bush years, she was really getting into the authoritarian nature of the Bush administration. Also, with another guy who was a very frequent guest of mine, was Mark Crispin Miller, was also getting into that at that time. They have followed similar trajectories since then. And
our friends. Yeah.
And our friends, because I do think that's also part of it, is there's support networks that take place here. But so that authoritarianism.
And with someone like Mark, 9/11 trutherism is a gateway.
Yes. But that again is another thing where you have a vacuum of accountability on some level, and people needs to rush in. Mark was also heavily involved in the election stuff, but there was some, real questions about our elections. When you have,
there's always a little bit of truth, right. And there are always progressive failures that are being fed off of. Right. And this is where, in the end, the book ends up being about how the right is creating a doppelganger of the left, taking pieces of a left agenda that I recognize, but we have abandoned. And this is where, we may still think, oh, yeah, we're the people who are taking on big pharma. We're the people taking on big tech. We're the people taking on these free trade deals. But are we? When's the last time we really did?
Right.
And we've actually been focused on a lot of other stuff, and that deep anti-capitalist critique that I think is really central to any kind of robust left has taken a back seat. And somebody like Bannon he's a strategic guy. And, that's what he did in 2016 with specifically free trade, right? Union guys who'd voted for Democrats in 3 election cycles, who'd promised to open up those trade deals that had deindustrialized their communities, and then proceeded to, advance more of those deals. And he said, come on over here, and Trump said, I'm going to renegotiate the deals and I'm going to bring the jobs back and so on. And what I see happening on the right with not when I talk about Bannon, I'm talking about the fact that he has been part of building a global network of far right political parties. One of them just got, a majority, the largest share of votes in the Netherlands. And it's this mix and match, right? It is not the old right. It's not the neoliberal right. It's not Dick Cheney's right. It is the right that is extremely xenophobic, extremely racist, transphobic, and mixing in, a critique of globalization, a critique of the trade deals. We're going to protect the social safety net from the immigrants, right? Giorgia Meloni as well. Another one of his proteges. This is what he did when he left the White House, is he went off to form this international network of far-right political parties. There's always a little bit of something there. But this, the thing about a doppelganger is that it's a way of looking in the mirror, right? I mean, if you read any doppelganger novel back to Dostoevsky, like, it ends up being a confrontation with the self. And this is what, this exploration has been for me, is like, I'm not that interested in her. I'm interested in what the fact that people are why are these ideas gaining traction? How are our own actions on the left helping to feed that? What can we learn from this? How can we see ourselves more clearly? How can we do a better job to take away some of their power? And I think when you look at, a figure like Sean Fain in the United Auto, like president of the United Auto Workers, and you see the kind of like real economic populism that he stands for, like, we're going to stick it to the bosses in his Eat the Rich t-shirt. That's Steve Bannon's worst nightmare. Somebody actually taking on elite power, because then it exposes the artifice of this kind of charade that's going on the right. Like, they're not taking on big tech. They're not taking on big pharma. They're feeding off of silences, abandonments, and pivoting over to their real agenda.